Hey, good morning. Um, just spent a week in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it. Purpose of the trip was pretty much looking at fire hazards in several different places. Started off going up to Tahoe, and we're working out by Fallen Leaf Lake, so Glen Alpine Watershed, which is where the Desolation Wilderness kind of drains into Fallen Leaf Lake from the west. And our job out there is to look at the fuel conditions in the forest and to try to model the potential fire behavior. So look at where you could have like a crown fire, or where you might just have kind of an older style surface fire, that like what we used to have more of when we had more fire. This is really a surveying trip. For the work in Tahoe, we were actually doing field work and plots where we basically measure all the trees within about a tenth of an acre, and then from that you can kind of extrapolate how many trees per acre and also the density of the trees, and run some models to figure out whether or not a fire would stay on the ground there or get up in the trees. And it was windy. We were kind of up there right on the front end of this pattern change in the weather, where we went from kind of high pressure and stable atmosphere to low pressure and a big wind event. So it's kind of a tough time to be on the road because there was so much going on with fire. Right? We were covering the line fire in Southern California. We were watching the Davis fire up in Reno area, and then bridge fire was taking off. But that's kind of how it goes right now for me. Is I make a living mainly on consulting, and all the time I spend on the lookout kind of stacks things up as fire season winds down for me to work a lot in for my day job. So I just wanted to kind of take us on a little field trip, look at some video from where we've been in the last week, talk about some impressions I had on kind of the state of fire hazard in the Northern Sierra, and talk to you about interpreting things we see on the landscape, and a lot of the stories about fire exclusion. Right, so in this area we're surveying up in Fallen Leaf Lake, there haven't been any fires there for a long time, and hence the forest has there's places where there's really major accumulations of dead and down logs and thick stands of fire intolerant trees like white fir, and kind of shade tolerant trees that come in and become established in places when you don't have frequent fire. We really covered quite a bit of ground. Our job there is to look at the whole Glen Alpine watershed. And one way to do that is just to hike up to the high points and look around. And so it's kind of what us geographers do, right? We're always headed for the high ground, trying to get the big picture. And along the way we stopped and we counted trees and tried to cover the basis of all the different kind of major forest types up there. So some places we have ponderosa pine and some larger trees, and then some places we have white fir dominating, and other places we get up higher, we get into lodgepole. There were some really incredible, we saw a lodgepole that was about 6 feet in diameter, up at about 8,000 feet. And up higher we got a lot of juniper and a mountain hemlock. So each one of those types of forest burns differently. We got different kind of surface fuel loading based on the pine needles versus fir needles versus hemlock needles versus lodgepole. Generally, as you move up higher, you get into species that don't burn as often, but then when they do burn, they burn hot. So, oftentimes in lodgepole, they won't burn for a long time. They've got really thin bark. They aren't really adapted to like frequent fire. They're killed by fire, but they don't get fire very often because where they grow, their needles aren't very flammable, and you usually just won't like get a fire that just kind of creeps through lodgepole and like you would in ponderosa pine, where you've got this nice fluffy needle load. So places like lodgepole, they tend to not burn very often, and then when they do, they burn hot, and they all get killed and then that's the natural thing. They reestablish in an even-aged clump. Versus ponderosa pine, which with the long needles, it carries fire really well, and it can have fire frequently without killing large trees. So in a lot of these places, we can see the influence of fire exclusion in that we've got a lot of white fir that's grown in as kind of thickets in the ponderosa pine stands. So we counted our trees. Hard thing about modeling a place like Fallen Leaf Lake is just that the wild card is really the wind. So the wind was howling up when we were up there, with this kind of fall weather change. And that's when you're going to get a big fire in a place like this. And so modeling really doesn't work very well for trying to simulate how big wind-driven fires behave. This is a wilderness area. It's not like we're going to go in there and log a bunch of trees out. It's unlikely that we're going to put prescribed fire in there up in the wilderness. So what would you be trying to achieve if you were going to change the condition? A lot of our work focuses on designing change into a system. How do you use fire or logging or other interventions to restore conditions to maybe something that is more fire resilient or where the large trees are going to survive? So it's a little hard to hike around in a place like Desolation Wilderness where you really don't have many options, right, for management. Some places, some people would say, well, it's wilderness, you shouldn't manage it at all. But humans have been managing landscapes for tens of thousands of years, irregardless of kind of these funny lines we draw on the maps now. So we also saw a lot of places in Fallen Leaf Lake where mechanical thinning has happened over the last 20 years. They've kind of logged out smaller thickets of trees, and those places feel a little more hopeful to me in that we can put prescribed fire in there and consume some of this heavy fuel load that's accumulated over the last 100 years of fire exclusion, and potentially prevent these areas from being completely incinerated when we have our next Caldor fire or another event that pushes down into the basin. The whole thing about Tahoe is that mechanical thinning and everything else tends to work best on the lower slopes, and so the upper slopes of all the way around Tahoe, where you get over 30% slope or so, they're pretty hard to treat, and there's a lot of dead white fir in there. And we saw some signs, I think, in Homewood for that it was a fire-wise community, and then just right down the road, there's this insane fuel loading right up to people's houses. And so, I've been hearing, common theme is people think that by becoming a member of a fire-wise community, that somehow it's going to help your insurance rates. And then we've also just seen a lot of places in our work in the last month or so where we see the fire-wise community sign, and then we see insane fuel loading. And really just, it's kind of a veneer of resilience or a veneer of safety. We can't expect insurance companies to take the fact that you've got a sign up in your yard and that you do a couple days a year of brush cutting to mean that somehow you're going to get this magic pass from insurance companies, just because we're seeing a lot of places that on paper are fire-wise that are just, they're not. In general, I think our expectation of how thick forest should be to be resilient is way off. We've still, even in areas that we've thinned, most areas that we've thinned in the last 10 or 20 years, we haven't thinned enough. And so I think what we're seeing from the Dixie Fire and other fires that are pushing through areas that we've thinned and just killing every tree is that it's difficult to make a fire resilient forest where you've got a lot of trees that are, say, 50 or 60 feet tall. The fire resilient forests are the trees that are big and thick and no branches for the first 50 feet. One common theme of this trip, even stuff that's thinned isn't thin enough to handle more severe fire weather. I'm not trying to throw Firewise under the bus completely, just that it's, the town of Cohasset was designated as a Firewise community, and still, hundreds of structures burned up there. We need a lot more prescribed fire in Tahoe. There's been a bit done. State Parks has done some. But there's just been a ton of thinning done there in the last 20 to 30 years that really needs follow-up. And smoke is a big obstacle to people burning more. capacity. There's, we saw a lot of unburned piles. They've made some progress in Tahoe. Like 10 years ago, you drive around Tahoe and you could count literally thousands of burn piles. Still, there's burn piles out there, and we need to burn a lot more in Tahoe. And if you live in Tahoe and don't like smoke, and you want to shut down burning, you're just kind of guaranteeing that the place that you love is going to get lost in a forest fire. That's another theme from this trip, is just that we love places like Cohasset to death. We love places like Truckee. A lot of people want to live in the woods, but then when you build your house in the woods, then firefighters have to put out all the fires within 30 miles of your house. And so that's part of the problem, is living in the woods kind of guarantees that we're not going to be able to let fires burn, and that there won't be any woods left. Smoke is a reality of burning. We have to burn the forest more if we want to have forests. And if you live in a forest and you don't want to breathe smoke, you're part of kind of the bigger picture that's dooming a lot of our forest lands to become something else, like brush and oak. Okay, moving on from Tahoe, we drove over on Highway 89 through Sierra Valley and over to Quincy. The corridor along Highway 70, going over from Quincy over to Portola. A lot of that area hasn't burned in a big fire, and it's some of the only area left in Plumas County that hasn't burned in a big fire. We've seen from the Bear Fire, the North Complex, Dixie, what big fires look like in forests that look like that have been fire excluded for a long time, that have not really been thinned enough. And so it's a little spooky to drive some of these forests and wonder if it's going to be next. And it's daunting to have this project right now where our job is to figure out how to put more fire on the ground, because a lot of the ground that we drove on there is not in a good condition to put fire on the ground. And especially along the Highway 89 corridor, where you've got really thick forests running all the way up to the top of the mountain. Ideally with burning, you start at the top of the mountain and you work your way down, and that way you can't have an escape that burns up into the thick forest above. So that whole kind of corridor, Sloat, Kromberg, Greenhorn Ranch, those are tough places to kind of gain a foothold and to put fire on the ground. Really, we need to put fire on the ground at the top of the ridge and bring it all the way down to the highway. That's going to be tough. We can do smaller, low-intensity burns around people's homes and burning pine needles and stuff like that, but as far as really impactful projects that are going to work at the scale of the problem, we're not going to solve that with little 5 or 10 acre kind of safe burns at the bottom of the hill. Caltrans has worked along Highway 89 and left a lot of slash there, and so it's kind of hard to, as a fuels person driving through and seeing that there's just red slash all over the place. See that too with tree work out there, is that a lot of the tree work leaves slash on the ground. So another thing that came up on this trip is just you see a lot of Mountain Enterprises trucks and other big utility service contractors out there working for PG&E, spending billions of dollars on vegetation management. I see that my bills are going to go up. PG&E's asking to raise rates because they're spending all this money on vegetation management. The money they're spending is not really materially changing the nature of risk on the landscape. It's not going to stop big fires from happening. It's just kind of covering their liability so it's less likely to start right off their power line. But all this work they're doing is kind of patchwork and not strategic. And when I say strategic, I mean they're not putting in a thinning along a road that's going to become a important fuel break. They're cutting along their lines, and their lines kind of go all over the place. So it's frustrating to me that we're footing the bill for all this inefficient work that's from a fire behavior standpoint. It's just about PG&E reducing the risk to their company of starting a fire that's going to cost them a lot of money, and hence cost us, the ratepayers, a lot of money. I went out to lunch with a PG&E executive a while ago, and he asked what I thought they should be doing what could they do, PG&E do, to kind of change the outcome of fires. And I said, well, you need to work on more strategic, like landscape scale stuff. Like if PG&E wants to mitigate the hazard of their hydroelectric power lines in the Feather River, well, then maybe they should be thinking of like burning 10,000 acres along the rim of the North Fork Feather River, in conjunction with the Forest Service. If we spent, as much money as we're spending on pruning every tree along every power line, on things like that, then maybe we could stop a fire that PG&E started that at 30,000 acres instead of it burning 1 million. So that's frustrating. The whole forestry sector right now is being impacted by this kind of subsidy where all this money that ratepayers are subsidizing for PG&E to spend billions of dollars on vegetation management, it drives up the cost of forestry work, right? So if you can go make union wages and have all the benefits and everything else to work on a tree crew, utility tree crew, then you're probably going to do that instead of going and like doing hand thinning work in the forest. So that's kind of a drawback of all this investment PG&E is making in veg management, is they've inflated the job market for forestry work, and they've really driven up the cost. So that spills over into everything. So if you want to hire someone to come cut brush in your yard, it's harder to find someone who can just come out with a chainsaw for $30 an hour and a chipper and do a bunch of work. Now you're looking at like thousands of dollars an acre to hand thin and pile. So that's something I think of when I see all these utility tree crews out there. So we got to Quincy and we went to a meeting with the Fire Safe Council, and we talked about the project we're doing there to plan out fuels. Talked a bit about letting fires burn in the recent footprints of Dixie Fire and other large fires, and kind of got pushed back from the Forest Service, saying, hey, this is not realistic at all. The public does not support letting fires burn at all. And I said, well, we've got these opportunities in Dixie where there's like 10,000 acres of hot burn, and you get a lightning strike out there in the middle of that, and you're sending crews to put them out. And the response from the Forest Service rep was just like, hey, the public is absolutely intolerant of letting fires burn on the Plumas. They're traumatized by the Dixie, by the North Complex, by the Camp Fire, and it's not going to happen. And to me, that's really frustrating, because I asked, well, are you asking people what they really think? Or are you just counting Facebook likes? And I feel like it's a responsibility of people that do support a kind of balanced fire management to speak up if you feel like you want the Forest Service to let fires burn in the backcountry. You need to let them know, because they're responding kind of to like all these comments from people that applaud them every time they put out a fire, even if it's in the middle of like a huge burned area that has no potential. I think another thing that kind of made me think about that is just that, like, during the park fire, people in Chester were really concerned because they saw evacuation warnings in zones adjacent to Chester, and no one was really telling them the story that they were safe from fire because they're surrounded by all of this recent salvage logging from the Dixie Fire. There was no way a park fire was going to get to Chester. And so I feel like the agencies are they're failing in the mission of communicating with the public, because that would have been really useful during park, for someone to just like Forest Service to put out a video saying like, look, don't worry, in Chester you got no hazard of a fire getting to you. And no one was doing that. I don't feel like it should have to be the job of the lookout to like tell people in Chester they're going to be okay, when agencies aren't really sensitive enough to message on this stuff. The spatial nature of fire hazard. Anyway, so there's a little drama there in the meeting, but so we have to have these conversations. So around Quincy, there's a lot of great bike trails, and they make for good scouting. So we got to ride bikes around Quincy, and there's a lot of great potential to use fire around Quincy, the Black Oak Forest especially. There's been a ton of thinning done around Quincy in the last 30 years, and so our mapping project there is to identify all the areas that are kind of in good condition right now to do burns, to use burning to follow up on a lot of work that's been done in the past. We got to go out with Bill Jacks. Bill Jacks is a prescribed burner that works with Terra Fuego Resource Foundation. We've worked with them a bit, And Bill took us out to Butterfly Valley, and Butterfly Valley is really one of the places in California where people have been using fire the most to protect their communities. There's been a ton of burning on private land, and then the Forest Service recently completed an 800-acre burn all around Butterfly Valley, and so we went out and looked at that. That was interesting. Lots of different kinds of burning that have been done there. Some landowner burns that were really low severity. Plumas Underburn Cooperative is burned out there with CAL FIRE with private residents, and then the Forest Service is burned. Big project. So we looked at that. That was burned in the spring. And that project got pretty hot. There was places that there was really fairly high severity, like higher on the slope. And so that brings up, when people see a lot of dead trees in a prescribed burn, it often brings up a lot of judgment or regret or grief. And that's something that Bill and I talked about quite a bit.
So this is part of the Forest Service 2022 prescribed fire, and we're on top of the ridge here above Butterfly Valley. And, this is one of the places that got some severity from the prescribed fire and, some perceivable negative impacts. But by far and large, the prescribed fire was a great benefit to the forest. And this will be some open patches in the future where oak and brush might come in the future and create a diversity in the habitat type here. So yeah,
it looks like most of the big conifers survived.
Most of them, yeah. Some of them are died immediately after the prescribed fire, and now 3 years later there's some that are now dying. But there's still a lot of huge trees that are healthy in this stand, and will have a decreased competition in the future from the mortality in this prescribed fire up here. So yeah, it was pretty shocking at first when I came up here to see how much mortality there was after the prescribed fire, and it took a minute for me to realize that, hey, this is necessary. Like, there's too many trees in here. That's one of the great things that fire does, prescribed fire especially, provides for tree spacing as well as genetic fitness. So yeah, some trees died and created some openings in the forest that's going to create a healthier stand in the future.
We've got to understand that prescribed fire is not a precision tool, that it's fire's messy, and fire, sometimes it kills trees randomly, sometimes it kills the trees you were trying to save. And that in these places where we're so departed from normal fire regime, like, we've got these incredible fuel loads, and that includes, like, at the base of some of these big pine trees, like huge thickness of, like, all the sloughed off bark and pine needles and everything. I think someone said, like, well, if you stood in the same place for 100 years, there'd be a big pile of crap around your feet too. And so that's difficult, because when we burn like 800 acres, we can't just go out and rake around every big tree. And the roots on some of these big trees start to grow up into that big pile of debris. And so often, if you burn in the spring and there's some moisture in the soil, it can steam the little roots that have grown up into that duff layer, and it can kill the big trees. And so, like, obviously we don't want to kill all the big trees when we burn. And so it's tough. There's kind of a narrow window of opportunity to burn in those big trees without harming them. And so we saw some patches in the burns around Butterfly Valley where there was high, acre or two where all the trees were killed. But in general, when you look at how many trees were left, it was like kind of like what you want for a natural spacing. Like, these trees got killed because they were too thick, and even under low severity fire conditions, they were too thick for the fire to stay on the ground. When we go out in thin areas previous to burning, we still have this mindset that a lot of the metrics that we have for how thick a forest should be are based on kind of faulty science that was developed by economists to figure out, like, how you can make the most amount of money off of trees growing in a given place. And those equations didn't really include a concern for fire and fire loss. And so, like, oftentimes if you put silviculturists in charge of putting together a thinning, with the intention you're going to burn it, we're still leaving too many trees in there. We're still trying to kind of maintain a stocking standard that's based on these kind of faulty ideas of how many trees should be in the woods. So yeah, people don't like seeing dead trees in a prescribed burn. You've heard me say before. If I go into a forest with a feller buncher or a mechanical logging machine and thin it, I'm going to kill a lot of trees. Oftentimes in these thick stands, we're going to kill 50 or 60% of the trees. And people seem to be okay with that, and they don't see the dead trees standing. We cut them down, we haul them away. Most people don't really count stumps. And so, but if you do the same thing with prescribed fire, and there's a bunch of dead trees standing there, then people think that you failed and that you didn't know what you're doing. So we're going to have to change our appetite for, we've got way too many trees in the forest. We're going to kill trees either with chainsaws or we're going to kill them with prescribed fire. The economics aren't there to, and the access and everything else isn't there for us to be able to go and like mechanically thin every acre that needs to be thinned out. So prescribed fire is like one of the only tools. And so I don't know if we'll get there in my career where people are all right with letting fires burn and seeing patches where you kill every tree. But I think it's probably not going to look like, there's no way that's going to look like a Dixie fire where you've killed every tree for 10,000 acres. A lot of these places where there was high severity in the fires around Butterfly Valley are coming in thick with black oak. And I think that's another place that we've kind of had a really narrow focus, that foresters are really conifer-centric. Generally, the way that we proceed after logging is with herbicide to kill all the hardwood. So the brush and oaks and everything don't compete with our seedlings. So this landscape that we inhabit here, Plumas County, Butte County foothills, used to have a lot more oak. And the oak are filling in these gaps. So that's a good thing. When I see a lot of oak out there, I'm hopeful. When the Dixie Fire first backed down in around Story into the Feather River Canyon, the first day or so, we got some good fire effects in there. It didn't kill all the trees. There were places where it spread, even spread rapidly, but we got decent severities. And then we had a huge run that kind of burned from just below Rock Creek Dam all the way up to Twain, and that really roasted. And so it was interesting to look at that and see that the oak are coming in really strong in there. There's a range of oak. There's there's interior live oak, and there's canyon live oak, and there's black oak. But the oak are coming in like crazy. And so you look across these slopes and you see there's tons of oak coming in. And so I think that's an interesting part of where we're at with all this change on the landscape. It's not like we're not going to have forests. But and I think one thing people say a lot is like, well, if you don't salvage log and plant conifers, it's just going to be a big brush field for the next 200 years. It's like, well, that's not really true. It's going to be scrub oak, and then it's going to be oak. And the oaks have a lot of benefit on the landscape. Wildlife can't eat ponderosa pine bark, and so wildlife can browse on young oaks. They can eat the acorns. Acorns are like super important part of both the cultural landscape and the kind of wildlife food landscape. Turkeys, deer, bears, acorns are super important. So it's hopeful to me to see like a ton of oaks coming in the Dixie Fire scar. Getting down lower in the canyon, I was checking out the campfire scar, which is now 6 years old. Campfire, we hear everything we hear about the campfires as the most terrible fire in California history, and it was. Working in Paradise after the fire was traumatic. So many people were deeply traumatized by the campfire, but because it happened so late in the season, a ton of the area actually burned in the 150,000 acres that the campfire burned with a beneficial severity. And I know that's a tough thing to parse out. There's so much loss in the campfire, and it is such a terrible thing. But like in the Feather River Canyon, a lot of the fire effects we got from the campfire were really beneficial and gave that forest a fire return interval that reset kind of the hazard. And so areas that burned at a low severity in the campfire in the Feather River Canyon basically got fireproofed for the next decade or so. And so you can really see that when you look across Highway 70, when you look across the North Fork Feather below Polga, you see all these huge expanses that still have a really healthy conifer forest. Also in there, you can see the brush coming back, 6-year-old brush coming back like crazy. It'll be ready to burn again here. The campfire burned through 10-year-old brush in Concow. And so the fuel loading is extreme down around Concow. We'll be set up here for another big fire to be able to burn out of the Feather River Canyon around Concow in the next 5 to 10 years. So this landscape's always changing. There's all this stuff to see. And this road trip, I think, was largely, the theme was fire exclusion, opportunity. There's a wide variety of things to talk about out there. So that's a sampling of my week on the road. Definitely felt bad not being able to report on all these fires for you guys, but that's the way it is right now. Yeah. Appreciate all the support that you guys are putting in the Lookout. So when we're not reporting on fires, we're out looking, and so we'll always bring you back some stories. Right now I'm working on gathering some more material for a video about the park fire. Folks are sending me great material. So if you have videos or photos from the park fire, I'm working on a video of the whole unfolding of it and the fire effects and kind of the fire behavior. So if you have anything you want to share with or without attribution, email me. There's a link on the lookout.org. And I can send you a Dropbox link. But again, great stuff, and appreciate all your guys' support. So that's all for now. Thanks a lot.